Hey, welcome to a very special edition of the North American Review Literary Roundtable, where we talk about writing, the writing life, and of course what's new in the pages of the North American Review. We're coming to you today from Studio One in the production house located on the campus of the University of Northern Iowa. I'm Jeremy Schraffenberger, the associate editor of the magazine, and I'm joined around the table by one of my diligent editorial colleagues, Vince Gotera, and we're also very pleased to welcome to the podcast the poet James Selar, whose remarkable poems The Island of Cats and The Island of Cats 2 appear in the summer 2012 issue of the North American Review. Before we start talking to Jim about his poems, I'd like to say that these absolutely blew me away when I first read them. I was attracted, and I think, Vince, you probably were too, I was attracted immediately to the strangeness, but also this attention to literary tradition. So, Jim, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for those comments. It's always good to hear. You know, we write kind of in a vacuum, so to hear somebody being blown away by a poem does an English major's heart good.
So I wonder, maybe we can begin by asking you to read these poems for us.
Sure, yeah. Okay, and there's two of them, and the first one is simply The Island of Cats. And it begins, of course, both of these are inspired by Louise Erdrich's novel Love Medicine, which came out in 1984. And so the first poem begins with an epigraph from that novel, which is, "He was his island. He was me. He was his cats. He did not exist from the inside out, but from the outside in." And here's the poem. Moses appeared on Washington Avenue, dressed in the tanned and striped skins of cats. His mother saved him from the plague by pretending he was already dead. That's how he became the man outside of time. He lived on the island of cats, where he walked backward and wore his clothes backward. Just as the thief was pulling away in my Honda, Moses materialized outside my office, a visitor from the land of apnea, an arrhythmia of the soul. He was lonely for story and came to absorb our world of golden handshakes, where we believe if a lie is told often enough, it will magically turn into the truth. New to traffic jams, the first time I came to a halt on the freeway, I thought my heart had stopped beating. Blood has paused in the arteries. What Moses doesn't know is that the old folkways have taken a dive in the polls. Rather than the coup that's needed, we've settled for the ritual sacrifice. But something is dead in the body. Burning an effigy will not cure an organ failure. It's just one frustration replaced with another. With dangerously low levels of iron, my partner has started eating meat again before his system shuts down completely. Sometimes I stop breathing at night, and he prods me awake. The significance of an episode changes with its placement in the story. Tragic at the end, comic at the beginning. When all the planes landed, we could hear the birds. As the thief sped away in my car, the television crew set up to interview Moses, who urged us to pledge allegiance to narrativism. Good evening, Zeitgeist. Our top stories tonight. That's The Island of Cats. And because the novel is just so rich, I didn't feel like I was done. So I wrote The Island of Cats 2, which also begins with an epigraph from Love Medicine. This one's that poem I just read is, of course, free verse, and it's all in one stanza, but this poem is in couplets, or free verse couplets, I suppose. And the epigraph is, again, from Love Medicine. The greatest wisdom doesn't know itself. The richest plan is not to have one. From Louise Erdrich. One act of violence changes brain chemistry. I was never the same boy. Sometimes the king kills a sacrificial lamb to prolong his reign. The dilapidated chassis of the body politic, an engine of great size and age, unworkable, forestalls its breakdown with a ritual burning. Immediately I saw the cats, their mouths as fresh and bloody pink as petals. I am superlative and offering. I need to take a break before the brain gets white hot. The king has been with cats too long. Their hearts are like cold balls of silk. Nothing I could buy or eat would feel so good as ending this. My cat with a toothache tries to hide her suffering. She should say what she means when she means it, and listen to it later. People see what enjoys you, the screen swallowing a face. After the flying monkeys disemboweled the scarecrow, the Tin Man said, "Well, that's you all over."
Wow, those last lines of that poem really, for me, kind of brought the whole poem together. It's such a strange and almost a sudden introduction of a seemingly completely different idea or theme. And, maybe for some of our listeners or some of our readers who will read this in the magazine, for them, can you talk about what Louise Erdrich's character, her novel, has meant to you? And,
okay.
I think I'm asking about the genesis because knowing about Moses in the book helps you read it, but I would argue that you can read it without having read her book.
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course I'm a huge fan. And I do write poems that tend to have allusions in them. And, Louise Erdrich's work is something I'm just constantly drawn to. So, I live in the Twin Cities, and Louise runs a bookstore there. Mm-hmm. And of course, I've met her and talked to her and know her. And I first read Love Medicine in grad school. Mm-hmm. And it's, I read it when it came out, basically, and honestly, it kind of went over my head because she's doing something she started something very new, Faulknerian, but for a new generation. And so since then I've read, Plague of Doves, which I teach in class, and I just read her newest book, which comes out next month. It's called The Roundhouse. So much beautiful work. So I went back to Love Medicine and read it again, probably shortly before I wrote these poems, which are still, for me, very new poems. And I think so what I'm saying is I know Louise, and I know that she's a dog person. She writes a blog on her bookstore's website, birchbarkbooks.com, mm-hmm. and at times she has her dogs write book reviews. So when I read Love Medicine, and she actually does have, I think the chapter itself is called The Island of Cats, and there is Moses Pillager lives on the Island of Cats, and it's one of her many characters who she's sort of documenting how genocide happened, where diseases were deliberately introduced to kill off indigenous peoples. And so one of the miracles was this character's mother had hidden him among cats to save his life, essentially, which worked. And so I'm like, okay, a dog person praising cats, I got to do something with that. But she's such an amazing wordsmith. I really wanted to sort of pay homage. And of course, some of the lines that I read in The Island of Cats 2 are from her, like, their hearts are their hearts are like cold balls of silk.
Yeah.
That's her line. But in the first one, The Island of Cats, I was conflating a couple of things. Her character appearing sort of in my city.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're asking about inspiration. I'm not.
Yeah,
this is not what the poem means.
Yeah, right.
But my car was stolen on the job, and I witnessed it happen, and I actually ran up to the car and tried to stop him.
Wow!
And so that's the sort of the beginning and end of the thief pulling away in my Honda. But there's also, you can tell from the language that I'm working a bit with sort of the current, not just the current economic situation, but the way the language that we use to talk about the economy. in which I see a fair amount of hypocrisy.
Right.
So all of those things, novel, life, news, all kind of converging for me in these poems.
Yeah.
James, looking at the poem and seeing all the first-person pronouns, I was reminded about one time when I was giving a reading and someone in the audience asked, do all your poems start from family anecdotes? You know, and since then, this was probably 10 years ago, since then, I thought a lot about that in my own work and also in other people's work. And so you've alluded to this already when talking about the thief who took your Honda, and I wondered if you could maybe say some more about the first-person narrator in both of these poems, whether that's a speaker or a persona, or whether that's somehow you yourself.
Oh, okay. Yeah. In my book, Undoing, the I is very much me. And then what happened after that book came out in 2008, I wanted to try something a little bit different. So I did, in newer poems, kind of focus on external texts. And what I think I'm doing in The Island of Cats, or some of those other poems which sometimes respond to, it couldn't be Alice Munro, or it can be Tilly Olsen, or it can be, Johnny Guitar, a 1950s Western starring Joan Crawford. So movies or books or whatever. I was trying to maybe abstract it a little bit where it wasn't, there is still an I think because it's a lyric poem. There is the sense of an I, whether the I is me or some register of my voice. But I kind of wanted, because I didn't want to keep complaining about my horrible childhood. And what I was trying to do with these external texts was comment on how there are, Willa Cather has said, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, there are 3 or 4 human stories, eternal human stories, and they keep getting told over and over again. And of course she didn't mean cliches, she meant myths and fairy tales. And so it is sort of our love of story, our knowledge of story, which maybe is somewhat, born in us, wrapped up in our DNA. And so what I was trying to show with some of these poems is how, even though we don't have a pantheon of Greek gods anymore, we have our equivalent, and they exist even in popular culture or in literary culture.
That's great. My favorite part of The Island of Cats was toward the end when we have this moment where the I is revealing something about the partner having started eating meat again, and then it shifts as though we're trying to understand that through narrative by saying, well, the significance of this episode, not just any episode, but particularly this one, changes what it means. And so it's towards the end, and you're right, it has a kind of tragic tone to it.
Okay. Yep. Right.
And then I love the way this ends with the ellipses, saying these are our top stories tonight. So then the poem ends up really becoming about just what you're saying, these myths, these stories.
Yeah. Right. I'm a teacher, as you guys are. And so it's hard not to be influenced by what we read or what we say in the classroom. And so, I do think of these. You're right. There is an I in here, and there is certainly my story. It's true. My partner was not a vegan, but a vegetarian. And then, his doctor said, eat meat. Yeah. So, but obviously that has some sort of resonance for me. And somehow it worked out for me to be a way in which I could comment on storytelling, on the need, the sort of essential human function of storytelling.
Speaking of teaching, I'm wondering if that teaching and other things that you do, like editing, how that actually, we've talked a little bit about it here already, but how that influences the way you approach writing a poem.
how teaching and editing.
Yeah, teaching
influenced-
and editing, and then you turn your attention to writing when, of course, you have the time between all the teaching and editing.
Right.
Do you think it's changed you as a poet? Because you have
Okay.
a vast amount of editorial experience. You have a wide range of teaching experience.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. I think, I did edit. I was the poetry editor at Milkweed Editions for a few years. And, I think I was. I think I was influenced by, there's this wonderful writer in Montana. Her name is Melissa Kwasny. And she, her book, Reading Novalis in Montana. And so her obsession is the Romantic era, as well as philosophy. No, actually, her obsession is modernism. I got a little thrown off there by my reference to her title. She's a HD scholar. But she had done something that, I read the manuscript. I said, this is it. This is the one. And what she was doing was she was kind of talking about herself. She called them reading poems, where she would basically go for a walk in her garden, and then there would be a book in her head. And so that sort of showed me, a way to be to reference external texts, or to include not just like a one-line allusion, but to have a whole poem, that responds to. I guess it's ekphrasis, basically. And then another poet I worked with was Alex Lemon, who tends to kind of do very sharp juxtapositions, which certainly inspired me. And then yet another poet I worked with was Erin Lorsung, who just her love of lyrical beauty and kind of her willingness to borrow from any tradition that serves the meaning of her poems. Those certainly inspired me and influenced me. As a teacher, as you know, we have to hold so much in our heads at one time. It's kind of a charging up, and so we get to that kind of pitch where it is sort of all there, and I want to get it down. I want to preserve it on paper. And it's kind of a good thing I do, because then 6 months later I'm like, I read that book. But yeah, at the moment of teaching, or at the moment of discussing the text, it's really alive in my head.
Yeah, I can only hope that having worked with you and these poems will influence me the way that working with the writers you've worked with have influenced you. And I can actually see all three of those elements in these poems. But changing the way that you respond to text, not just an allusion, as you say,
right.
Actually transforming Moses into your own kind of character. And then I see the Island of Cats too as that kind of stark juxtaposition, especially with that very end line. And of course, there's lyric beauty throughout these, throughout these poems.
Thanks.
Something that struck me about these poems, these two poems in particular, are the references to politics. You have, for example, in the Island of Cats, our world of golden handshakes, where we believe if a lie is told often enough, it will magically turn into the truth. And then a mention a little later of polls. In an Island of Cats 2, we have a character, the king, and also this phrase, the dilapidated chassis of the body politic. And of course, these phrases of yours are put me in mind of our ongoing election at the moment. And so I don't have a specific question, but just wondering how politics influences your poetics or your poetry, and perhaps vice versa, whatever that might mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, you're right that those lines are intentional. And I'm trying to, it's interesting that they do still feel applicable to the current political landscape. We're 40 or less than 40 days from the election. Mm-hmm. Although I must have written this probably a year ago, and I'm trying to remember now what was happening. I do remember in Minnesota the state government shut down for the summer.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of jargon and political speak, sort of to justify or explain or blame each other. And, my chapbook, Metaphysical Bailout, which came out in 2010, is sort of also about just sort of the language, the lexicon of the news and of politics, and just how much sort of how euphemism-ridden it really all is. And, you know, if I have a position on that, it's kind of amazing how many different ways we can spin the justification for the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. You know, if we just say that the economy has crashed, therefore, then it is permission to. Louise Erdrich has another line where, in Plague of Doves, actually, it's the situation provided an opportunity for them to act on their prejudice. Mm. So there's, you know, the foreclosures in the bank market. The bank foreclosures in the housing market, I should say, or all of the layoffs. You know, I'm sure 5-10 years from now there'll be history books about all of the greed and corruption that, you know, in the name of, in the name of the economy, how bigotry was able to work itself out unchecked. So that's what I'm trying to point out.
Would the antidote then be, as Moses is offering at the end, this pledge of allegiance to narrativism, or is that, or should we read this ironically? Because I get our top stories tonight. I read it as either ironic or earnest, depending on whether I feel optimistic or pessimistic about the whole situation. But I mean, if Moses represents a way in order to understand or learn folkways instead of freeways, I mean, what is your sense about how? And maybe this is a bigger political question. Is narrativism, in some sense, the antidote to all these problems that you mentioned?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer to it. I think that probably if there's a charge, it is tell your story. Moses is there to tell his story, but the reporter is going to co-opt that.
Yeah.
I'm in this poem trying to tell my story.
Right.
So I don't know that stories in and of themselves are good or bad. It's perspective and identity that are going to influence.
Yeah.
You know, who comes out,
yeah.
who wins.
Do you want to talk about? You mentioned two of your previous books, but you have a book coming out in 2013 in the spring.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Rancho Nostalgia?
Yeah, Rancho Nostalgia. The title sort of is a variant of an old movie called Rancho Notorious, which is a Western that came out in the 50s starring Marlene Dietrich. The whole book, Rancho Nostalgia, I think it's spring 2013. It comes from a little press called Dream Horse Press in California.
Right.
And it's my movie poems, or it's my movie book poems. So yeah, I've got poems in there ranging from those sort of campy westerns, as well as there's a Shirley Temple poem, or a poem in riffing on a Shirley Temple movie. A lot of film noir, sort of like some of the worse the movie, the better the poem, I think.
Yeah.
So I pay a fair amount of attention to B movies, and again as books as well. So yeah, that's Rancho Nostalgia.
That's great. J.P. Dancing Bear is the editor. Of
correct.
We've published him a few times, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah,
great guy.
Has it been good working with him?
Oh, he's awesome. Yeah, definitely one of these tireless workers in the name of poetry. You know,
Bear has a new book these days. I don't know if you remember from Facebook that he was doing these birthday poems.
Oh, right.
And he's collected some of those.
Okay.
Or selected some of those into a book recently.
Yeah. Salmon Publishing, is that who does? I can't remember.
I don't remember if that book specifically is from Salmon.
Right. Because you might have more than one publisher. That's right.
I wanted to ask about craft. Looking at these two poems, I see, well, Jeremy has already mentioned the wordplay of freeway and folkway, and more particularly about sound. In the middle of Island of Cats, we have truth, and then in the next line, traffic, and then another pair, halt and heart, some consonants going on there. So I thought maybe you could tell us something about the consciousness of, how conscious rather you are when you work with sound and wordplay, or is it something that just happens?
Oh, okay. That's nice of you to notice, so thank you. Wish I could take credit for that. I don't think I can, but I do like, hopefully when you're in the zone, that stuff starts clicking for you. What I am drawn to, so that maybe it happens naturally, is like so many poets, I just love words, or I love sort of dialects or just jargon, the sort of constructs that we create to deal with concepts. Those things, but I mean not just the concepts, but the sounds of those words. So often they're really not saying anything new, but it is just sort of a new set of sounds that becomes popular, and that just sort of attracts me.
Yeah, I especially like at the end of The Island of Cats too, when we have it's not quite the same thing that you're talking about now, but I can tell that you're listening to idiom when you have the phrase "people see what enjoys you," and that's the kind of phrase that makes you turn your head a little bit and listen a little bit more closely to just such a familiar phrase. What you enjoys you. What is the difference there? So I appreciate the word play, and not quite in like punning, but playing with language in these poems.
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you for coming to our podcast and letting us talk with you. We always end our podcast with a round of what are you reading, and if you don't mind telling us what you've been reading, that would be great. I'll go ahead and start and say I have been reading, but what I've been reading and I've been excited about most lately hasn't been a book at all, but has been poems that I've assigned to my modern and postmodern poetry class. I've been reading and listening to them through the Poem Talk podcast. And the Poem Talk podcast is sponsored by the Kelly House, Penn Sound, and the Poetry Foundation. And the host, Al Filreis, invites 3 poets, somewhat like what we're doing now, to come and talk about one poem. And they do a close reading of it. And I can't tell you how much it's not only been enjoyable just for me to, as I'm biking to work, listening to this podcast and thinking about poetry, but how effective and useful it has been in a classroom situation where I think what we're trying to do for our students in some ways is teaching them how to talk about literature, and for them to kind of eavesdrop on people doing that. I think that's the best model there could possibly be. So I know it's advocating our podcast competitor, but I would encourage everyone to go over and check out Poem Talk. Vince?
Well, I've just finished a book by our colleague Scott Kowalty, and I think maybe Kim mentioned last time.
Kim mentioned it, in the first podcast.
The book is called Brothers' Blood, Heartland, Cain, and Abel. And this refers to the famous or infamous mass murder of an entire family, husband, wife, 2 kids, quite young kids, in the 70s. And Scott had been following that case, which still is undergoing appeals for the last, 20-something years. And he had done a lot of research and so on. And this book is the fruit of that research, where it's not exactly a whodunit, because Scott comes to the conclusion that, in fact, the guy who was found guilty he thinks is actually the killer. And this is a family member, brother of the husband, but it's a very interesting book because it's partly like In Cold Blood, in the sense that we get into Jerry Mark's head, and then also it's part case book, because a lot of the interviews and depositions and articles and so on, interviews also that Scott did, are part of the book.
Jim, what are you reading?
I guess appropriately, since I have used Louise Erdrich poems, her new book, it's called The Roundhouse, and it's a sequel of sorts to her Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Plague of Doves. And so it has some of the same characters a few years later. And it's kind of, again, sort of her exploration of the themes of revenge versus justice and sort of the connectedness of history to our daily lives, and also how progress, if there is any, is incremental. It's sort of the sum total of many small actions.
You said you wrote a review of this?
Yeah, it's going to be in the Minneapolis Star Tribune. I think actually this Sunday.
All right, this Sunday. Check out the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Thanks, everybody, for coming by. I want to make a couple of announcements. We are still accepting submissions for the 13th Annual James Hurst Poetry Prize, and H.L. Hicks is going to be our final judge. Go to NorthAmericanReview.org for details about how to submit. And when you do submit, you will get a subscription. So I just want to make sure that that our potential contributors know that. Also, go to Facebook, like us. It's facebook.com/NorthAmericanReview. Follow us on Twitter at NorthAmerReview. And, of course, you can always just visit us on our website, NorthAmericanReview.org. Thanks to our editor, Grant Tracy, pinch hitting tonight. He was our recording engineer. And special thanks to Keith Kennedy and all the good folks here at the production house. All right, we'll talk soon.